on scraps of paper, air sickness bags, and company letterhead. They wrote their final goodbyes. "Be good to each other," one man wrote to his children. "I won't make it." These were the last words of passengers on a flight that was just 12 minutes from takeoff. A flight that suddenly and violently went wrong. Welcome back, everyone, to AeroExploration and another installment of This Week in Aviation History. My name's Jim, and this week, we're going to bring you the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123, which goes down in history as the single most deadly single aircraft crash in history. The story of Japan Airlines Flight 123 begins with a sound. A high-pitched squeal from a cockpit alarm that instantly tells you that something is terribly wrong. Then a frantic voice from one of the pilots in Japanese. Hydraulic pressure is dropping. All lost? All lost. Then the terrifying roar of rushing air. A crippled Boeing 747 is silhouetted against the sky, with a massive, gaping hole where its tail should be. For the next 32 minutes, an experienced flight crew would try to do the impossible. Fly a plane that had become totally unflyable. So let's go back to August 12th, 1985. Tokyo's Haneda Airport was buzzing. It was the eve of the Obon Festival, and a time when families were traveling all across Japan to honor their ancestors. So the mood was festive. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747 SR, was headed for Osaka and was completely full. This aircraft is similar to the one that was just at AirVenture this year, which was the Pratt & Whitney 747 SR, which is a shorter model of the traditional 747. On board were 509 passengers and 15 crew members. They were businessmen, families on vacation, students heading home for the holidays. The aircraft itself, registration JA8119, was a workhorse. The SR here stands for short range, a model that Boeing designed specifically for Japanese busy domestic routes. Now, this meant that it had gone through far more takeoff and landing cycles and the pressurization cycles that go with it than a typical long-haul 747. Now, nobody knew this at the time, but that fact was a key piece of a puzzle that had started to come together 7 years earlier. At 6:12 p.m., Flight 123 lifted off into the summer air. In the cockpit were 3 highly experienced crew members: Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda. For this crew, a 54-minute hop to Osaka was pretty routine. As they climbed over Sagami Bay, the seatbelt sign was switched off, and the flight settled into a familiar rhythm. But unbeknownst to them, the rest of the crew and the passengers, this plane held a deep secret inside the plane structure. This is a hidden flaw that had been stretched beyond its absolute limit. It was a ticking time bomb left behind by a maintenance error years before. On June 2nd, 1978, this very same plane had a rough landing in Osaka, scraping its tail on the runway. The incident damaged the plane's rear pressure bulkhead. Now, this is a dome-shaped wall that separates the pressurized passenger cabin from the unpressurized tail section. A team of Boeing technicians was brought in for the repair. Now, the procedure itself calls for a single continuous splice plate with 3 rows of rivets to join the damaged parts of the bulkhead. But the technicians made a disastrous mistake. They used 2 separate plates instead of the one, even cutting one of them to make it fit. This shoddy repair left just a single row of rivets to handle the immense stress of thousands of pressurization cycles, reducing the bulkhead's fatigue resistance by about 70%. So how come nobody knew? Well, this mistake was hidden under overlapping plates, so it went completely unnoticed during other inspections. The plane was certified as safe and it was sent back into service. Investigators later calculated that this faulty repair would fail after about 11,000 flights. On August 12, 1985, as Flight 123 climbed towards its cruising altitude, it was on its 12,318th flight since the repair. Its time was up. So at 6:24 p.m., 12 minutes after takeoff, as the plane climbed through 24,000 feet, this weakened bulkhead finally ripped apart. The sound was a thunderous bang that echoed through the cabin. All the air from the passenger cabin blasted into the unpressurized tail section like a shockwave. The force of this explosion was catastrophic. It blew out a huge section of the tail cone and critically tore the massive vertical stabilizer, the tail fin, clean off the aircraft. An amateur photographer on the ground would later capture a chilling photo of the crippled jet, its missing tail starkly visible against the sky. This blast of air also severed all 4 of the plane's hydraulic lines, which were the lifeblood of the 747's controls. Without this vital hydraulic fluid, the pilot's yokes and rudder pedals were completely useless. They were now flying a 300-ton missile with its engine still running. Now, in the cockpit, it was chaos. A master alarm screamed, and Captain Takahama, initially thinking that a cargo door had blown, was quickly corrected by the flight engineer's terrifying report: hydraulic pressure down, amber lights on. All 4 hydraulic systems were gone. They had no ailerons, they had no elevator, they had no rudder. They were disconnected from their own aircraft. Meanwhile, back in the passenger cabin, a thick white fog of condensed air instantly filled the space as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The plane began a violent and sickening up and down movement. It would pitch up, slow down until it almost stalled, and then plunge into a terrifying dive, only to gain speed to climb back up again. If that wasn't bad enough, now combine it with a wobbly side-to-side motion called a Dutch roll. This threw 524 people aboard through a brutal roller coaster of G-forces. At 6:25 p.m., just 46 seconds after the explosion, Captain Takahama would enter 7700 into his transponder, which is the universal code for the aircraft having an emergency. This would alert air traffic control that the flight was in trouble. He would then calmly call air traffic control and request a return to the airport. For the next 32 minutes, the world would listen as these 3 men tried to do the impossible: land a plane that simply refused to be flown. The crew of Flight 123 were in a fight against physics itself. Every bit of their training screamed at them to use the flight controls, but the flight controls were useless. The only thing they had left was the engines. So by carefully varying the thrust between the engines, they could make crude and sluggish turns. If they pushed the throttles forward on all 4 engines, it would raise their nose, while reducing power would lower it. It was like trying to paint a masterpiece with a sledgehammer. The struggle of this crew was preserved forever on the cockpit voice recorder transcript. "Lower the nose," Captain Takahama commanded again and again. "Yes, sir," replied First Officer Sasaki. His voice strained from pulling on a useless yoke. But they weren't just fighting the plane. They were fighting the symptoms of hypoxia. This is what happens when you have inconsistent oxygen going to your brain and you have various symptoms that can affect your judgments and your abilities. So as the jet bucked between 7,000 and 13,000 feet, this inconsistent oxygen flow was slowly clouding their judgment. Air traffic controllers would offer a closer airport, but the crew insisted on returning to Tokyo, a decision possibly influenced by the subtle effects of their oxygen starvation. They fought this plane for 32 full minutes. For the passengers, those 32 minutes were an eternity of terror. An off-duty flight attendant named Yumi was one of the 4 survivors. She recalls helping passengers with life vests and shouting instructions for brace positions as the plane swayed violently. Around her, people realized they may not make it. They started writing farewell notes on anything they could find. A 52-year-old businessman would write a 7-page letter in his notebook to his children. These final heartbreaking messages found in the wreckage are a haunting window into the last moments of those on board. Back on the flight deck, the crew managed to lower the landing gear, hoping that this added drag might stabilize the plane. For a moment, it seemed to help, but as they fought to turn back towards the coast, the wounded 747 refused to cooperate any longer, and it was on a path straight into the mountains. The terrain alarm would start to blare in the cockpit, telling them to pull up. The pilots would shove the throttles to maximum power in a last and desperate attempt to clear the mountains rushing towards them. The nose came up, but it wasn't enough. At 6:56 p.m., 32 minutes after the explosion, the right wing of Japan Airlines Flight 123 clipped the mountain ridge. The massive aircraft would cartwheel, slammed into a second ridge, and exploded into a massive fireball. The deadliest single aircraft accident in history had just occurred. What happens next is almost as tragic as the crash itself. A nearby United States C-130 military transport plane spotted the burning wreckage and guided a Japanese helicopter to the site that same night. But citing the darkness and treacherous terrain, the helicopter crew reported no signs of survivors and chose not to land or send down rescue personnel. The official rescue was delayed until the next morning. So for 14 agonizing hours, anyone who would have survived the impact was left to wait. When rescue teams finally were able to hike in, they found utter devastation. But amid this wreckage, they also found a miracle. 4 survivors, all of them female, were alive in a relatively intact section of the tail. They were the off-duty flight attendant Yumi, a mother and her 8-year-old daughter, and a 12-year-old who was found in the branches of a tree. Yumi would recount the events from her hospital bed. She described hearing the cries of other survivors in the darkness of the night, right after the crash. There was a boy crying for his mother. I clearly heard a young woman saying, "Come quickly," she recalled. But as the cold night dragged on, these sounds faded into silence. Yumi's testimony strongly suggested that many more people had survived the initial crash, only to die from their injuries and exposure while waiting for help that arrived too late. As you can imagine, the investigation into Flight 123 was a massive undertaking. When the flight recorders were recovered, the mystery was solved. The evidence that pointed to the ash pressure bulkhead failing was undeniable. A botched repair with 2 spliced sections instead of the one, held together by a single, overstressed row of rivets. The official conclusion of the crash was that it was caused by improper repair performed by Boeing 7 years earlier. The fallout from this disaster was immense. The president of Japan Airlines resigned in shame, and one of the airline's maintenance managers took his own life. Boeing's reputation was also seriously damaged, and the tragedy forced a worldwide reevaluation of aircraft maintenance and repairs. Stricter inspection rules were put into place, and designs were changed so that critical systems like the hydraulic lines are never bundled so closely together again. The legacy of Japan Airlines Flight 123 is found in the safety regulations that protect flyers to this day. But it's also a profoundly human story. It's the stories of the 520 people who were lost, immortalized in their farewell notes that they left to their families. It's the story of 4 miraculous survivors who will carry the weight of that night forever. And it's a story of a flight crew who, facing an impossible scenario, fought with incredible skill and courage for 32 minutes against a fate that had already been written. Many have tried to replicate their flight in simulators, and almost all of them have failed. Thank you so much for watching this edition of This Week in Aviation History right here on AeroExploration. If you find stories of human resilience compelling or want to learn more about events in aviation history, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into incidents just like this.